So thanks for coming today. My name's Kurt. Hi. We're going to talk about the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. We're going to keep it at high level. It's going to be a pretty short presentation. Mostly just we're going to talk about, well, let's see what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about, I'm a big fan of starting with context. So we'll talk about what it is, where it fits in the federal government, who leads it, and kind of how it came about. And then we'll talk about responsibilities. What does the FDA actually regulate? What does it actually oversee? And we'll spend a little extra time focusing on how they manage drugs and medications, because that's very relevant to our business, and also it's a little bit complicated how they dice things up. And we'll end with things FDA has been focusing on a lot recently. So any questions before we kick off? Anything you want to make sure we cover? All right. Okay, so context. Very broad. FDA is a part of the executive branch under the Department of Health and Human Services. It's a pretty complex organization. It has 25 offices and departments and centers, but it's not a very large organization comparative to other organizations in the executive branch. It is for the Health and Human Services. It's a decent size, but it's not their biggest by any means. Here's some of the organizations. It's a little bit small, but I'll read them off to you. So we have the Biologic Evaluation and Research, Device and Radiological Health, Center for Drug Evaluation, Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, Center for Tobacco Products, Center for Veterinary Medicine, Oncology Center of Excellence, Office of Regulatory Affairs, Office of Clinical Policy and Programs, External Affairs, Food Policy and Response, Minority Health and Health Equity, Operations, Legislation, Policy Legislation, Office of the Chief Scientist, and the Office of Women's Health. The ones I highlighted are the ones that, again, are particularly relevant to definitive healthcare and what we do. There are also, some of these offices even have sub-offices and sub-departments. So again, like I said, it's a very complicated organization, even for the Department of Health and Human Services, but it is what it is. FDA is actually currently going through a leadership change. So the head of the FDA for a couple of years was Scott Gottlieb. President Trump appointed him he appointed him as part of the transition team in 2016. And Gottlieb had been working for the FDA off and on for about 6 years. He stepped down this spring. And so currently we have Norman Sharpless, who is the acting commissioner. We don't actually currently have an appointed commissioner of FDA. So there's Scott Gottlieb, and then Amy Abernathy is his deputy commissioner. Both have a strong history in cancer, oncology, aging research, and practice. So that's an interesting element of current leadership, is the leadership is historically very focused on one element of health, but very intimately aware of and involved with the medical process in general. So these are the people who are leading it. You know, if we do this training again in 5 months, might be a different person up there, but that's where we're at right now. Generally speaking, how do I put this? There have been, I'll put it this way. Scott Gottlieb, who recently stepped down, was widely considered and bipartisanly considered to be a very good appointment by the Trump administration. He did a very good job and advocated for everybody he was supposed to advocate for, according to most individuals. Now, anytime you have any kind of organization, there's going to be critics. There are some people who say the FDA is crooked and in bed with the businesses, big business. Other people say it's very anti-business and puts a lot of burdens on them. So nobody's 100% happy with anybody ever. So that's true of the FDA, but Gottlieb, who just stepped down, was generally considered to be pretty okay at what he did. So in the Health and Human Services, their budget is $1.3 trillion. Most of that is, if you've gone to the Medicare and Medicaid and CMS lecture, goes to Medicaid, Medicare, and CMS. But the FDA is a lot smaller. It's, I think, 3 billion out of 1.3 trillion, which is about 0.3% of Health and Human Services budget goes to this administration. That being said, according to some estimates, I've seen anywhere from the FDA regulates anywhere from 15 to 25% of commodities purchased in the U.S. So I'm always interested in like those balances between how much we spend on it versus how much it touches your lives. So everything from, you know, your medical expenses, but also you eat food pretty regularly. And FDA, as we'll see in a second, also controls or regulates stuff like cosmetics and animal products. So a lot of the economy is touched by FDA. Questions about any of this? Again, very high level stuff, but I want to make sure we have the right context. So, oh, I forgot a picture. So if you've been to the history of healthcare in the US, you know that up until about 1880 or 1890, there was no such thing as healthcare in the US, or frankly anywhere, not in the way that we consider it. And that's true of the administrative growth of FDA as well. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a couple pieces of legislation that tried to start to regulate food and drugs. One was a Vaccine Act. It only lasted for about 6 months. Another was a Biologics Act, which lasted a little bit longer, but was relatively hard to enforce. But that started to change in 1906 with the Pure Food and Drug Act. This was passed by Teddy Roosevelt. This is during kind of the biggest progressive era of the United States history. Again, this is when like national parks were formed and stuff like that. Teddy Roosevelt was big on strengthening central government. So the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed, and that was really what kicked off the existence of the FDA. At the time, it was actually under a couple different departments. But eventually all these things that we would currently call the FDA were consolidated under the Department of Chemistry, which then 3 years later had its name changed to FDA. So really it was this Pure Food and Drug Act, a bunch of different isolated departments formed to make sure that really the Pure Food and Drug Act, what it did was it was mostly focused on not tampering or anything like that, but just people selling bad food. Like before 1906, it wasn't like federally illegal to sell tainted meat, so to speak. Maybe locally, but not so much federally. So that put that into place, and it mostly focused on preservation and making sure that good steps were taken to make sure things were healthy and what wouldn't make you sick. There wasn't a lot of proactive legislation or documentation to make sure things were efficacious or healthy. It was more keeping it from making you sick, if that makes sense. It's basically trying to get to zero as opposed to getting to positive. So then the biggest not boon, but the biggest landmark was the passing of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. This is still, I mean, it's been amended a whole bunch of times, but this is still the foundation of what the FDA does. Everything, not everything, I'd say 80% of what FDA enforces and monitors is found in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act or its amendments. And this obviously broadened it to more than just keeping food pure, but also to making sure that not only something harmful, but that it's actually efficacious and actually does what it's supposed to do. That was kind of the first step. So up until the 30s or 40s, we'll say, it was about keeping it from killing you, and after that, it was more about keeping you healthy and doing what it says it's going to do. Again, I'm brushing in broad strokes, but that's kind of the narrative of how it evolved. In 1944, the Public Health Services Act was passed. This basically was the first time the government ever created for itself quarantine power. Now, FDA doesn't 100% own this kind of quarantining, but as we'll see in a little bit, a lot of the stuff it does own is the passing of biologics, whether it's medicine or food, across state lines. So if quarantines are in effect, there's a heavy dose of FDA intervention in there because, again, it's federal, so it's all about crossing state lines. If you want to quarantine something, that's who's not in charge, but who's relevant there. Another very key landmark, again, not as key as the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, but in 1962, there's the Kefauver-Harris Amendment. This is, again, talked about in other trainings, but this is in Europe, mostly in Germany, in the late 50s and early 60s. There was a drug called, well, not a drug, there was a compound called thalidomide that was used to lessen morning sickness and general nausea in pregnant women. And it was soon rapidly found to cause massive birth defects in the children who were born from people who used thalidomide. And luckily, the head of the FDA at the time, or not just the head, but the leadership of the FDA at the time, didn't authorize thalidomide to be used in the U.S. So it barely touched the U.S. at all, but it was a big issue in Europe. And after that kind of blew over, the U.S. passed this amendment that basically said, we're no longer making sure drugs are just safe. We're making sure they are substantially, what is the phrase they use? Substantial evidence of drug efficacy. So it's not that it's just safe, and it's not that it's safe and kind of does what it's supposed to do. It has to actually really do something, and we're going to force you to prove it before it even goes on the market. So again, we're going to talk a lot about, the drug the side of the FDA, the D side of the FDA, if you will, and that 1962 amendment really brought us to the landscape we are today. Before then, all these clinical trials and stuff didn't exist because nobody needed to prove that it was super efficacious. They just needed to prove it wouldn't hurt you too much. And it was up to you to make sure you actually spent your money on something that was efficacious, we'll say. Last but not least is the Hatch-Waxman Act. This, again, there are so many different acts. I'm trying to do the high-level ones. This is one that Ronald Reagan passed that was tried to simultaneously strengthen the patent on new drugs and new pharmaceuticals to incentivize, the industry to research. Because if you do decades of research and your patent only lasts for 5 years, there's just no business reason to do that. So it simultaneously strengthened patent durations and also when the clock starts on patents, because if you technically patent a thing but it takes 20 years to get approved, sure, your patent lasted 30 years, but you only really got 10 years of it out of making money from it. So they changed when the clock starts on a patent, all that fun stuff. But they also created an accelerated process, or at least an easier process for generics to be approved. So it simultaneously strengthened patents, but also made it easier for generics to be approved. So 1984 is a big deal, and it strengthened the generic side of the FDA, which we'll see in a little bit. Any questions about any of this kind of like legislative history, administrative growth? I think it's just always useful to see kind of how an organization started, so you see what its DNA is, and what originally it was focused on versus what it's very much focused on now. Cool. All straightforward. All right, so next we're going to talk about responsibilities. So FDA regulates, in broad strokes, these 8 things. Food, right? That's the F. And food is, there's a lot of food. It's very complicated. I know, that's my most profound statement today, is there's a lot of food out there, at least in America. So FDA divides up food into a lot of different categories. I'm trying to find where I put, oh yeah, so there's food additives, added substances, and dietary supplements. And that's kind of going from, let's say natural to unnatural on that spectrum. FDA also works very closely with the USDA, because USDA handles, the direct animal products. So it's not like FDA is the only organization looking at food in the U.S., but really it does everything that isn't specifically an animal. And so that's food. Obviously, make sure that things are healthy. Make sure that things are packaged and labeled well. Over the past few decades, a lot of the initiatives to get packaging clear and labeled and honest, that's driven by the FDA. That's a big initiative that it's been in the forefront of the FDA for maybe 4 decades now. Next are drugs. We'll talk a lot about that, but prescription drugs, non-prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs, generic, everything. Medical devices. I just want to make sure we all understand, like, medical device can be a lot of things, right? It's not just like an MRI. It's also a tongue depressor is technically a medical device. A pacemaker, the dental medical devices. So your braces are technically medical devices according to the FDA. Implants, pacemakers, prosthetics, all that fun stuff. So FDA regulates that as well. Radiation emitting products. This one surprised me because I was thinking, okay, radiation emitting is X-ray machines. But again, I was only thinking in the medical term because I work here. But also, microwaves and sun lamps and stuff like that are regulated by FDA. In fact, either earlier this year, at the end of last year, the Scott Gottlieb, who was the head of the FDA, commissioner of the FDA, did a big, we'll say, crackdown on tanning salons and stuff like that. Then there's biologics. Biologics is super interesting. It could be a lesson on its own, but we're not going to do that today. But biologics cover everything that's super messy and not easy to do with a chemistry set is kind of how I think about it. So vaccines, anything involving blood, gene therapy, tissue, organ transplants, all that kind of stuff. Then there's animal and veterinary, and that's mostly just animal feed for farm animals, pet food, and other pet products and veterinary products and devices. So it's not like I just went to a pet store yesterday to get food for my son's guinea pigs, because they're actually my guinea pigs. And so all those little toys and stuff, not regulated by the FDA, but the stuff that the vet uses is regulated. The hay that I feed the guinea pigs is technically regulated by FDA, as is their food, and the supplement that I bought that I spray on their food. The salt lick, I don't believe is regulated by the FDA. I looked that up. I'm pretty sure the salt lick is not. So it's fun how much it touches your life. Cosmetics. Cosmetics are straightforward. And again, this is an interesting intersection, but it makes sense. Cosmetics go on your body. Your body is your body is full of holes, is probably a good way to put it. And mostly your skin, lots of pores. And so it absorbs all the stuff you put on it. So color additives, skincare, nail polish, and perfume. Anything that you wear on yourself that could probably get into your system is covered under FDA. And then there's tobacco products. Cigarettes, tobacco, and smokeless solutions that obviously are all the rage these days. So that's what FDA regulates. Now you kind of understand why I said it's between 15 and 25% of all consumer spending is touched by FDA. Questions about any of these broad strokes? Cool. Very attentive class. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about how the division of labor is for FDA and their different departments of drugs. And again, there are centers, and then some centers have sub-centers or sub-departments, so we're going to keep it as high level as we can. And for more information, just so you know about how a drug is approved, we'll be touching this a little bit, but for more information about how a drug is approved and the process in depth, we have a couple different courses on the intranet about drug approval and stuff in the pharmaceuticals learning vertical. So you're welcome to look at that. I'll touch on that, but if you want more in depth, highly recommend you do that. So I'm not going to say the long nerd. This is called CEDAR. That's just how they call it. So CEDAR is where when we think about drug approval, we're mostly thinking about CEDAR. Other stuff touches drugs, but if we're thinking clinical trials and all that, it goes to CEDAR. The current good manufacturing process, which is a fun acronym because you'd think they could just get away with saying good manufacturing process, but they had to add that little C in front of it. So CEDAR manages or dictates what is even acceptable from a manufacturing standpoint. Not even talking about efficacy, not talking about clinical trials, but what are the conditions that are acceptable in a manufacturing environment for drugs. Trials and NDAs. So the way a drug, and again, I'll keep this high level, the way a new drug is authorized is there have to be 3 phases of trials before an application can even be submitted. The first phase is very small. We're talking dozens. And it's mostly just to determine what is the highest safe dose. I mean, they're looking at lots of variables, but as far as the FDA is concerned, it's mostly looking at safety and dosage. The second one is a little bit larger. It's more like 100. So that's the second phase trials. Those are looking at both dosage and efficacy. So does it actually do what it's supposed to do? Typically, phase 2s are more like acute patients, people who have a more pressing need, or at least who have if whatever disease we're talking about, have a more acute or dire version of it. For lots of reasons. A, they're more willing to try something experimental. B, it's a lot easier to see a 1% change in a big thing than it is in a small thing. So it makes more sense to do that. And then stage 3 trials is almost exclusively about efficacy. By this point, they've already determined maximum dosage and healthy dosage. Stage 3 is mostly about efficacy on the scale of 1 to 5,000 participants. So they go through all those phases, they pass, and then they get to submit an NDA, new drug application. And if that goes through, then they get to submit to FDA, or they get to submit to the Office of Prescription Drug Promotion all their marketing materials. So before the initial marketing spam, they have to show all their different marketing materials, because especially since the 80s, marketing, they've been pretty strict about marketing. I mean, the first TV drug ad wasn't even until like 92 or 91. And they started to have to do like all the side effects that was regulated by this OPDP. It was regulated by that around the late 90s. And let's see what else. The OP, I know I'm skipping around a little bit, but this is the life cycle. So the OPDP also has really 2 mandates. One is that when it's advertised, it's only advertised for the use that the FDA approved it for, which is currently an interesting fight that they're having regarding CBD supplements, because it's being, and this is true of a lot of supplements, they're kind of just, they're often positioned as cure-alls, where, you know, this one supplement can make you feel better no matter what you have. So that's a problem that the Office of Drug Promotion has. They also want to make sure that in advertising, there's even weight given to benefits versus drawbacks, which is, again, why we now have commercials that tell you all the bad things that can happen. We're mostly familiar with the commercials, but there's also rules for written drug promotions as well. Like, you can't have the benefits be big and bold and the drawbacks be small in print. They have to be roughly equal. It's a whole thing. But that's what the OPDP does. And then once, so kind of skipping back over to CEDAR, once their marketing material's been approved, they market it out to the world, they still have to go through phase 4 trials, which is, you know, post-market trials, or during market trials, because hopefully it never gets post-market. But they have to monitor and make sure, again, both efficacy and safety are working as they said, because they still have only tested it on 1 to 5,000 people. There's a lot more than 1 to 5,000 people out there, and people are different. That's my second profound statement of the class. So that's CDER. They are also the ones, that is also the department that distinguishes between what should be a prescription medication versus what should be an over-the-counter medication. General rule of thumb is if even with over-the-counter, they always have the use as directed, but really it's just a measure of how bad is it if you don't use it as directed. That's the measuring stick they use to keep things simple. Questions about CDER or the Prescription Drug Promotion Office? Cool. So again, CDER is probably the most important one you'll think of when you think of FDA as far as the drugs are concerned. However, increasing in importance these days is the Center for Biologics, or CBER, which is super fun that they chose an acronym that sounds exactly like the previous one. So part of the reason this is growing in importance is just because of where technology is at. So over the past, it feels like a decade, it's really only been like 5 years. Over the past 5 years, CRISPR has taken off and gene therapy has taken off. And for all intents and purposes, individuals can work on gene therapies in their basements if they have a little bit of money and some connections. So things, so genetic testing and genetic alteration in gene therapy are taking off right now. And so CBER is bulking up a little bit. It also is in the process of determining a lot, of clarifying a lot of guidance that it gives out, because again, up until now, gene therapy was slow moving and more or less impossible. So that's CBER's growing a lot. Also, you know, all these vaccines and blood transfusions is always important, especially as we have outbreaks of things that vaccines can help with, and as we have disasters increasing in the world that people need blood for. And also because CBER is growing, because in many ways with our kind of more standard drugs, and this might not be true forever, but from a research perspective, we've hit a wall in a lot of different ways as far as what inert chemicals we put in your body that your body reacts to. Well, not all, a lot of the new and exciting developments in R&D in the medical field involve biologics, involve things grown in animals, involve these gene treatments. So there's still some interesting exploration in the industry regarding kind of your standard drugs. There's kind of a revival of like psychedelics and mental health. So that's a more standard drug. That's not a biologic, but largely the more neat things are biologics these days. And then there's the OGD, the Office of Generic Drugs. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's the office that basically regulates when a drug can become generic. That's part of the act that was passed in 1984 under Ronald Reagan. There's the new drug application, and this is the abbreviated new drug application. So again, that's part of the reason, part of the attempt to make generics in the market a little bit more presently. Generally, that works. About 90% of drugs sold are generic. That being said, over the past 6 months, there have been like 5 separate scandals about generic price fixing and stuff like that, that if you attend any of the quarterly industry updates we talk about. So we'll say it's an uphill battle, obviously. Not only do they manage the generic application process, they also help run the GDUFA program. And what that is basically it's a research-oriented program to help basically to help get generics off the ground. So it's not just you're a generic drug company. Good luck when you have an equivalent, a therapeutic or a biologic equivalent, come to us and we'll sign a piece of paper. They also support labs and write grants that help these companies and universities discover biosimilars so that they can get generic out. So these are this is kind of the constellation of the centers within FDA that are involved in the drug process. Again, it's food, it's cosmetics, it's drugs, it's medical devices, but obviously this is a big part of what affects our business. So I wanted to make sure we kind of understood that a little bit more. Questions about any of that, Chase?
What's the distinction as far as injectables versus vaccines? Do injectables fall under CDER?
Not all. So, well, give me an example. Which injectable are you thinking of? Yep. So currently insulin is a biologic because we haven't really, I don't think we have an FDA approved it's synthetic, but it's still a biologic. Insulin's a pain in the ass. So we're working on a pure synthetic insulin, but we don't currently have it. So that is a biologic. However, under CDER would be chemotherapy. So that's an injectable. It goes into your body. But it's not a biologic.
The other thing up there is allergenics falls under CBER. What's allergenics as it relates to that versus like Zyrtec or like other?
Oh no, so this is more research to determine allergies, stuff like like the scratch tests and stuff like that. That falls under them. Yep. I mean, there's more than that, but that's. Yeah. Other questions?
So you got pricing here under OBDP. Any idea where we are with that currently?
Ah, that's right. I did the asterisk for that. Good call. So last quarter, I can't remember what month. I think it was May. I believe it was FDA instituted a new rule. No, it was April. It doesn't matter. They instituted a new rule that said for prescription drug advertising, like on commercials, they have to give a price, like this drug costs X. And companies had a big problem with that. And it was they actually had that mandate overturned, or at least stayed in court. I can't remember which district. They had that stayed in district court. If you look at the most recent on the intranet, if you look at the most recent quarterly update, you can learn a little bit more about this. But anyway, the requirement by the FDA was challenged in court, stayed. So currently, they don't have to put drug prices on, but it's the ruling is obviously being appealed. If I were a betting man, I'd say it would make it to a circuit. It would get appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court refused to hear it. That's pure gut reaction, but that's just what I think is probably going to happen. So we do not have an end to that saga yet, but I'll keep you updated in the quarterly reports. Other questions? Cool. So what has the FDA been up to lately? And by lately, I mean past couple of years, since 2016 or 2017. Obviously, as you saw before, the FDA covers a whole ton of stuff, but these are a lot of their initiatives that they're kind of pushing. So they they have a big backup of gene and cell-based therapies that have been submitted to be approved, and they just have a huge backlog. Again, they need to buff out their CBER to make sure they can actually handle that, because it's only going to get crazier. That is a prediction I'm happy to make. So they're really trying to buff up CBER and get rid of that backlog. Also, this isn't purely FDA, but they're involved. They're also working on coming up with more guidelines and ethical guidelines for gene therapy. A few months ago, the first genetically engineered we'll say genetically engineered children were born in China. So that's a thing now. And it's not going to stop being a thing, I have a feeling. So that's a lot of what they've been focusing on, the gene and cell-based therapies. In 2018, and this is kind of at the mandate of Congress, they've been focusing on potential attacks on U.S. food supply. I believe that was incited by some, not FBI, by some intelligence agencies letting us know that that's could happen. So they've been focusing on that. Again, that's not because there has been an attack. That's because they're trying to prevent attacks. Obviously, the opioid crisis has gotten to be a lot more in the forefront of national conversation for the past 3 years. So the FDA is really cracking down on that. Drug pricing and competition, another thing that's been focused on over the past, not 3 years, but we'll say a year and a half. And so FDA is really working on, like I said, there have been some scandals about generics manufacturers colluding with each other to fix prices on generic drugs. So FDA is often part of the litigation against that. Supplements, I mentioned this earlier, but kind of a perennial issue with supplements is that they're often claimed to do anything and everything. And it's tricky because a supplement is by definition not a drug, so it's not under the same scrutiny as drugs are. It doesn't have to show that it's efficacious in the same way that a drug does. Really, supplements fall under the food part of the Food and Drug Administration, not the drug part of Drug Administration. So because supplements have those constraints, or rather supplements don't have those constraints, FDA is really pushing to make it clear that they're not drugs. Because supplements kind of ride that line of advertising themselves like they are drugs, but they don't go through any of the stuff that capital D drugs go through. So FDA is cracking down a lot on that, saying you can't, it falls under the Truth in Advertising Act, which is actually FTC, but FDA collaborates with them on that. So they're working with FTC to make sure you can't just advertise that you do things that you can't do, even if you're not a drug regulated by us. That falls under Truth in Advertising. And like I said, the reason this has kind of had this resurgence is because of a lot of legalization of marijuana products, particularly CBD is the new thing that everybody thinks solves everything. So, and who knows, it might, but it hasn't been proven because it's not a drug and hasn't gone through trials. So that's another thing. Tobacco innovations. This is was one of Scott Gottlieb's big initiatives. Was you've probably, well, maybe you haven't, over the past couple years, obviously there's been this explosion of, e-cigarettes, vaping, Juuls, all that stuff. And he's been really, Scott Gottlieb championed this, but FDA obviously is still working on it, on cracking down on those innovations. Not wiping them out because they're legitimate innovations, but back in the day, they used to have, for Camel cigarettes, they had Joe the Camel, who was this cartoon camel, and they got rid of Joe the Camel because it was argued that was marketing it towards younger people to get someone hooked for life on tobacco products. But the pressure now is like Juul products are all like flavored and like advertised towards younger people, and the logic is if Joe the Camel's illegal, why isn't advertising Juuls in this way illegal? So that's kind of a current battle that's being fought. And also, this is kind of boring, but they have all these 25 different offices in both conceptual offices that we were talking about, but also they have like 25 plus physical offices in the United States and the DC, and they're trying to consolidate all those and upgrade their environment, get them all to one space, have a higher, better technological working environment so that they can cooperate a little bit better. So that's really what FDA has been up to lately. A lot of these are ongoing issues, and they will develop as they develop, and we'll let you know as they develop. But that's a brief overview of FDA, how it functions in our government, how it functions in our economy, things it owns, and current things it's working on. Any questions for me?
I know you talked about how the last leader was generally bipartisanly
Mhm.
approved of. Is the FDA generally partisan or generally pretty neutral?
Um, I don't have a good answer for you. I think we live in a world in which every year the ability to be nonpartisan disappears, which I'm comfortable saying is a bad thing. Um, I think FDA is less partisan than others. Yeah, because it's one of those things where which side is against keeping their kids healthy, right? It's an easy argument to find common ground on, and this is actually evident in that there are only like two issues that have bipartisan support in Congress, and they are locking or putting a cap on or decreasing drug spending. The president's on board with that. Both houses of Congress are on board with that. Legislation is being proposed left and right to limit pharma spending, so that's FDA, and also the opioid crisis. Both sides of government, or at least both parties, are united in that. Now, how the solution to those problems is always everybody's going to have a different opinion, but the fact that they are problems and the fact that we all care about these problems is pretty universal. So FDA is generally not frowned on. I'd say if you wanted to look for partisanship, and this is purely my opinion, but like I said, some people think it's FDA is in the pocket of big business because they approve things it shouldn't. Some people think that all those trials and stuff are anti-business. So from an economic standpoint, there's a little bit of tension there.
Who actually dictates FDA policy? Is it only laws passed by Congress, or can the FDA impose new restrictions outside of things passed by Congress?
Yeah, so and this is more Civics 201, right? But so the executive branch makes policy, not law, right? So Congress passes the laws, and they create powers for organizations, and then the organizations determine what they're going to do with those powers. So within the constraints of the FDA's mandate, FDA basically gets to do what it wants, assuming it doesn't step on other people's powers and yada yada yada. But if FDA needs to do something new, like in the 40s, there were no quarantine powers, so Congress has to pass those powers. Then FDA manages how they go about quarantining. So that's kind of the perpetual struggle of executive versus legislative.
And the FDA leadership is all appointed. It's not elected.
Yeah, it's appointed. Yep. Other questions? All right, you guys have been great. Let me know if you have anything. We'll post the videos, the slides will be online, and we'll see you at the next lesson.